Dear Prime Minister Erdogan, we represent the major body of scholars who study genocide in North America and Europe. The Armenian Genocide was the most well-known human rights issue of its time and was reported regularly in newspapers across the United States and Europe. The Armenian Genocide is abundantly documented by thousands of official records of the United States and nations around the world, including Turkey's wartime allies, Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Polish jurist Raphael Lemkin, when he coined the term genocide in 1944, cited the Turkish extermination of the Armenians and the Nazi extermination of the Jews as defining examples of what he meant by genocide. The killings of the Armenians is genocide as defined by the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. 126 leading scholars of the Holocaust, including Elie Wiesel and Yehuda Bauer, placed a statement in the New York Times in June 2000 declaring the, quote, incontestable fact of the Armenian Genocide, unquote, and urging Western democracies to acknowledge it. We note that there may be differing interpretations of genocide, how and why the Armenian Genocide happened, but to deny its factual and moral reality as genocide is not to engage in scholarship, but in propaganda, and efforts to absolve the perpetrator, blame the victims, and erase the ethical meaning of this history. Such so-called scholars work to serve the agenda of historical and moral obfuscation when they advise you and the Turkish parliament on how to deny the Armenian Genocide. We believe that it is clearly in the interest of the Turkish people and their future as a proud and equal participants in international democratic discourse to acknowledge the responsibility of a previous government for the genocide of the Armenian people, just as the German government and people have done in the case of the Holocaust. Approved unanimously at the 6th Biennial Meeting of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, June 7th, 2005, Boca Raton, Florida.
The soldier hit me on the head with the butt of his rifle. I was a little girl. I was crying because I wanted to protect my mother. The Turk did not want me to be with my mother.
The scar on the forehead of Anush Avetisyan is a daily reminder of the Turkish army soldiers' violence, their bloodthirsty massacre of her father, little brother, and mother.
My brother was crying. A Turk threw a black cloth over him and threw him on the ground with all his strength. He was just a baby and he died. The Turks did it. They killed my mother and my father.
The stories of Armenian genocide survivors are weapons against the continued Turkish denial. Those who have been trying to keep these pages of history unknown and ignored for decades, not just by the Turkish population, but also by the world's powers.
There are a lot of ways of denial, and every one of them is being used by the current Turkish government and by those who the Turkish government has paid to write on its behalf, including some scholars here in the United States. One way, of course, is to deny that it happened at all. Say there just wasn't any genocide. That's a real hard one to put over if you've got lots of mass graves around. A second way is to say, look, it really wasn't a genocide, it was a war. It was a civil war, as though they were somehow mutually exclusive. Thirdly, you can blame the victims. You can say the victims really were enemies of the state. Fourth way is to deny that the killings occurred by direct murder, but instead were simply through starvation, through attrition. And then here's my favorite, which is the lawyer's argument that, well, it doesn't really fit the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention. And of course, that's nonsense, because it does. It perfectly fits the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention.
What we have now in Turkey is a new, entirely new generation of young people who had absolutely nothing to do with Turkish policy in 1915. But they're not only innocent of all of that, they're also ignorant of what happened. Why? Because the Turkish government and the Turkish Ministry of Education made sure that textbooks and any kind of book or any kind of discussion or any kind of political approach eliminated any reference to that.
Very common tactic of denial, to simply not mention it in the history texts. The same thing happened after the Cambodian genocide. There, for 30 years, there has been nothing about what the Khmer Rouge did in the history texts.
By denying the guilt of the Ottoman Turkish government, present-day Turkey transfers to itself that heavy burden. Armenia is a nation today with Turkey to the west and Georgia to the north. Ancient Armenia was in Anatolia, also called Asia Minor, the western two-thirds of Asian Turkey. Armenia is the first country that adopted Christianity as a state religion. Armenians speak an Indo-European language with a unique alphabet. Although the people have been ruled by Turks to the west, by Persians to the south, and by Russians to the north and east. Armenians today demand Turkey and the world recognize that the Ottoman Turkish Empire massacre of 1.5 million Armenians between 1915 and 1923 was genocide and not civilian casualties of the Great War, World War I.
Genocide is defined in the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as the intentional destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And then the convention goes on to list certain acts that constitute genocide, such as killing members of a group, creating conditions that are deliberately aimed at destroying the group, sending them out into the desert, for instance, at taking the children of the group away from the group, at forced sterilization, at that kind of thing is also genocide. The best example and the first huge genocide of the 20th century was the Armenian Genocide, in which the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turk regime, mass murdered about 1.5 million Armenians. It was intentional. It was the destruction of an ethnic and religious group, and it was done on a massive scale.
During the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, a Christian minority, lived as second-class citizens, subject to legal restrictions that denied them normal safeguards. Neither their lives nor their properties were guaranteed security. They experienced discrimination, religious persecution, high taxation, and limitations of their rights. Armenians were regarded as Christian infidels.
For Turks, the Christians, whether Christians or Jews in Turkey, were not religious, were not believers. They didn't believe in anything because they are infidels.
In the end of the 19th century, Armenians began agitating for autonomy. The Ottoman government, under the leadership of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, responded by organizing mob-led massacres of Armenians. Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II employed Turkish troops and Kurdish tribesmen to kill thousands of Armenians and burn their villages. According to French and English reports of the time, the Hamidi army killed 200,000 Armenians. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was called the Red Sultan, and the years of his rule are known as Zulum years, which translates from Turkish as years of horror. The worst atrocity against Armenians during the Hamidi massacres was the burning of the Armenian cathedral of Urfa.
3,000 women, children, elderly, they escaped in a church, and they thought that God was going to save them. but the entire church was burned and 3,000 people were burned in the church alive. The same thing happened to the Jews, where they put a few hundred people in a synagogue and they burned them alive. This is the worst thing that human beings could do to each other.
The second large-scale massacres of Armenians were held in 1909 in the province of Adana. About 15,000 to 30,000 Armenians were murdered within a few days. Entering the Great War, World War I, the Ottoman Empire was shrinking. Their army just lost the Balkan War that freed from Ottoman rule Christian Greeks, Bulgarians, and Serbians. Ottoman Turkey lost significant parts of its European and African territories. New regime Young Turks forced Sultan Abdul Hamid II from power and now led the empire. They adopted a policy of pan-Turkism and ultra-nationalistic ideology.
The Ottoman Empire decided to exterminate all Christians in Anatolia. And so the Pontic Greeks, the Assyrians, other groups who were also in Anatolia were also exterminated.
Primary cause of the Armenian genocide rests in the nature of the Ottoman Empire. The Young Turks, as they were called, the Committee of Union and Progress, they envisioned transforming this area from an empire that was multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, to one that was homogeneous, with a single ethnicity and with a single religion, which effectively then meant if everybody in Turkey was going to be a Turk and a Muslim, all the other populations, all of whom were also indigenous peoples, then would have to be eliminated, erased, expelled in some fashion, taken out of that country. And although many minorities were persecuted, the Greeks were expelled in very large numbers and with considerable killing along the way. The Assyrian minority was also persecuted. Subsequently, the Kurdish minority, even though they were Muslims, also faced considerable persecution and repression. Of these groups, the most violent treatment apparently was reserved, or is clearly was reserved for the Armenians, who were systematically destroyed through and through until there was not one of Armenian to speak of across the area called Anatolia.
We went through a lot. We used to go home crying. Mom, they don't treat us right.
The Young Turks, officially known as the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, were led by Jamal Pasha, Minister of the Navy, Enver Pasha, a Minister of War, and by the Minister of the Interior, and later the head of the government, Mehmet Talat Pasha. They wanted to have Anatolia just for Turks. World War I created the conditions for them to carry out the crime of systematic elimination of the Armenians from the Ottoman Empire for the purpose of creating a new pan-Turkic empire. According to Israel W. Charney, the Israeli psychologist, historian, and genocide expert, the elimination of a commercially viable minority fulfilled part of the nationalistic program to concentrate financial power in the hands of the state and promote greater Turkish control over the domestic economy.
They were very aggressive. They were in everything, in all the businesses. That's why.
World War I broke out in 1914. The Russian Empire, France, and the British Empire were opposed by the Central Powers, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Bulgaria. Some Armenians took the side of the Russians, and thus the whole Armenian population was declared enemies of the Ottoman government.
Most genocides occurred during wars, during either civil wars or international wars, because war, you see, is a way to dehumanize the enemy. And so when the Christian Armenians were identified as being what, in political terms, one calls a fifth column. In other words, someone who might ally themselves with the enemy, namely Russia, because the Russians are Russian Orthodox. They're Christians also. And the Armenians are Armenian Orthodox. The Turks said, well, we can't trust them because they're right in our heartland. And so we have to kill them all or get them all out of the Ottoman Empire. So I think that was a big factor. Of course, the evidence is that most Armenians were quite loyal to the Ottoman Empire. There were some, of course, who allied themselves with Russia, but that all was not, of course, justification for killing women and children or even men in this situation. I mean, the truth is that the genocidal project is one in which you try to exterminate an entire group of people, an entire ethnicity.
On the night of April 24th, 1915, the Ottoman government arrested over 200 Armenian community leaders and intellectuals in Constantinople. Hundreds more were seized soon after. They were all sent to prison in the interior and executed.
Intellectuals are always the first to be killed. And the reason, of course, is they are the ones who could organize an opposition, who could organize resistance to the genocide. So that's why they went after the leaders of the Armenian community in Constantinople on April 24th, 1915. Rounded them all up, took them all out, killed them, because that broke the back of any ability of the Armenians to organize a resistance.
CUP had long been planning the systematic elimination of Armenians. During the first months of the war, thousands of Armenian men were mobilized by the Ottoman government. Then they were gathered together and mass murdered. Afterwards, all able-bodied men of the Armenian population across the Ottoman Empire were massacred. To carry out atrocities against Armenian population, a special organization was created, made up of violent criminals released from prison. They were known as shotas.
The government itself took its own preventive measures by disabling the Armenian community by killing off all of its able-bodied men.
Monday, many men were arrested in Harput and put in prison. At daybreak Tuesday, they were taken out and made to march towards an almost uninhabited mountain. There were about 800 in all, and their clothing had been taken away. On Wednesday, they were taken to a valley, all made to sit down. Then the gendarmerie began shooting them until nearly all were killed. Some who had not been killed by bullets were disposed of with knives and bayonets. Among those killed was the treasurer of the American College. The same thing had been done systematically in the villages.
My father's father was jailed in one of the villages of Harper. And because he had some money, they kept putting him in jail. They would give some gold to the gendarmes and they would let him out. And it would go on like this until, they saw that the gold is getting less and less. One day when he went with my grandfather's lunch, no one was in the jail. And the jail was about a room this size and had 100 men in it. My father said there were not one there. And he asked the gendarme, where is everybody? And he said, they went to the bathroom. And that was it. They shot them all.
I was in the orphanage. Our priest was bringing food so we could eat. The Turks saw him. They threw away the food and then killed him. The Turks did it.
I never knew my father. I kept looking for him. The Turks killed him because he was trying to help the people. They didn't want him around. Մենք վերդումն էինք, թուրքեր եկան.
We were home and the Turks came and took my uncle and my grandfather away. My father was in the USA at the time. They tied men together 2 by 2 in the street in front of my house and took them away. Then I never saw them again. The Turks killed them and threw them in the Euphrates River. Women and children were left alone, hungry, without any means of support.
Their existence must come to an end, however tragic the means may be, and no regard must be paid to either age or sex or to conscientious scruples.
Through the months of May, June, July, the spring, summer, and autumn of 1915, the bulk of the Armenian population, which counted up to 2 million and more people in the Ottoman Empire, the vast majority was deported to Syria and to Mesopotamia. Throughout the year of 1915 and 1916, the deportees were driven deeper and deeper into Syria, and namely into the Syrian desert. In the process of deportation, it's primarily older men, women, all of the women, and virtually all of the children. And deportation meaning walking for hundreds of miles in the open, whether in the heat of the midday sun or in the cold of night. Obviously, exposure would take a huge toll, and the elderly, but especially the younger children, of course, were very vulnerable. They would starve sooner, they would tire out sooner, and the bands of killers that had been organized to stage the massacres, it seemed particularly to have focused on killing off children, because again the objective was not to simply throw out the Armenian population from Armenia, but to destroy this population and to be sure that they don't have the capacity to recover and regenerate and repopulate their homeland.
Armenians were deported from their homes, not just in the war zone, but from all areas where they lived. For the first time in the 20th century, cattle trucks were used to drive people to their final destination. The organized massacres of the Armenians will later become a role model for Adolf Hitler's plans.
People who are planning a genocide study previous genocides. That we can prove. Hitler himself said to his own generals, just before they invaded Poland, he said, "Kill them all." Who, after all, remembers the annihilation of the Armenians? He had clearly read the history. The same thing is true of the Rwandan genocide. We actually found in President Habyarimana's library, and this is truly chilling, a translation of Mein Kampf into Kinyarwanda, the Rwandan language. In other words, genocidists learn from previous genocides. The other connection is not just in methodology, and because after all, I think there is a connection in methodology. If you learn how to starve whole groups of people, if you learn how to, create conditions of life that are going to destroy them, that's one thing. But also there is a connection in impunity. If people say, look, that previous mass killing didn't result in any consequences, the people got away with it, so we'll get away with it.
The well-organized process of creating a homogeneous state was documented by British, German, French, and American eyewitnesses. German soldier Armin Wegner, although a wartime ally of the Ottoman Empire, risked his life to document the plight of the Armenians. Years later, in 1923, Wegner will give his daughter the Armenian middle name Anush, meaning sweetie, in memory of the thousands of dear, sweet, innocent children who vanished in the years of the Armenian Genocide, 1915 to 1923.
We are informed that foreign officers are finding along the roads the corpses of the indicated persons and are photographing them. Have these corpses buried at once, and do not allow them to be left near the roads. This order is recommended as very important.
When news of the Armenian genocide began to filter out, and the Turkish government had made every attempt to implement their policies secretly, they controlled the media, they suppressed all photography, so that there was as minimal reporting about the Armenian genocide. Nevertheless, the scale of the events was such that people became aware and news filtered out. And the great powers at the time, primarily France, England, and Russia, condemned the massacres and issued a famous note in which they announced that they would hold the Young Turk government, the Ottoman government, responsible for the crimes being committed. And they described them in this document, which was issued in May 1915, as crimes against humanity. This phrase, which perhaps was not necessarily coined on this occasion, but nonetheless for the first time, was used in a legal document and became the basis of the world's understanding of what was happening against the Armenian people, that the atrocities were of such a scale, that the persecution was so thoroughgoing, that these weren't just crimes against one people, but it had become a crime against all of humanity.
In the October 7, 1915 issue of the New York Times, this was written. Viscount Bryce, former British ambassador to the United States, in the House of Lords today, said that such information, as had reached him from many quarters, showed that the figure of 800,000 Armenians destroyed since May was quite a possible number. Virtually the whole nation had been wiped out, he declared, and he did not suppose there was any case in history of a crime so hideous and on so large a scale. The death of these people, said Lord Bryce, resulted from the deliberate and premeditated policy of the gang now in possession of the Turkish government. Orders for the massacre came in every case direct from Constantinople. In some instances, local governors, being humane, pious men, refused to carry out the orders, and at least 2 governors were summarily dismissed for this reason.
I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. The great massacres and persecutions of the past almost seem insignificant compared with the sufferings of the Armenian race in 1915.
Beginning in April 1915, news of the deportations and massacres began to reach the American embassy. Oscar Heiser in Trebizond, Leslie Davis in Harput, Jesse Jackson in Aleppo regularly posted the embassy with their own eyewitness accounts of the treatment of the Armenians.
It had just been announced that every Armenian, without exception, must go. A more pitiful sight cannot be imagined. They are ragged, filthy, hungry, and sick. That is not surprising in view of the fact that they have been on the road for nearly 2 months with no change of clothing, no chance to wash, no shelter, and little to eat. I watched them once when their food was brought out. Wild animals could not be worse. They rushed upon the guards who carried the food, and the guards beat them back with clubs, hitting hard enough to kill them sometimes. By continuing to drive these people on this way, it will be possible to dispose of all of them in a comparatively short time. The entire movement seems to be the most thoroughly organized and effective massacre this country has ever seen.
You're walking, they're so young. You want water. Forget food. In a little while, that little while never ended.
Starvation is one of the favorite methods of carrying out a genocide for several reasons. First, you can pass it off as though the people died from natural causes, as though there were a famine or somehow, they weren't directly killed. In other words, you create conditions in which they're going to die of starvation, but you say it wasn't our fault. After all, it was wartime. They didn't have enough food, and so they starved. So it is a way to escape from responsibility or accountability for the genocide, even though it is intentional. It's what Helen Fine, who's one of the founders of genocide scholarship, calls genocide by attrition. In other words, you kill off the people gradually. It may take several years, but nevertheless, it's very intentional.
The orders of the commanders may have been reasonably humane, but the execution of them has been for the most part unnecessarily harsh, and in many cases accompanied by horrible brutality to the women and children, to the sick and the aged. In many cases, the men were bound tightly together with ropes or chains. Women with little children in their arms or in their last days of pregnancy were driven along under the whip like cattle.
The Mesopotamian lower ends of the Euphrates River and Black Sea are known locations of the mass drowning of Armenian children. In the first period of the deportation, Ottoman Turks silenced world concern by placing some Armenian children who were left without parents in orphanages. However, the policy of the Turkish government to annihilate the Armenian children became evident again after the initial deportation, when most orphans were deported again and murdered on the way.
Only those orphans who cannot remember the terrors to which their parents have been subjected must be collected and kept. Send the rest away with the caravans.
Here is how a Turkish army officer who was ordered to accompany a convoy of deported Armenians described what he saw.
Being a member of the court-martial, I knew that deportations meant massacres. The children that the government had taken in charge were also deported and massacred. The infants in the care of the American Council of Trebizond were taken away with the pretext that they were going to be sent to Sivas, where an asylum had been prepared for them. They were taken out to sea in little boats. At some distance out, they were stabbed to death, put in sacks, and thrown into the sea. A few days later, some of their little bodies were washed up on the shore at Trebizond. I was ordered to take the women and children to Erzincan. On the way, I saw thousands of bodies of Armenians unburied. Several bands of Shotas met us on the way and wanted me to hand over the women and children, but I persistently refused. I fell ill and wanted to go back, but I was told that as long as the Armenians in my charge were alive, I would be sent from one place to another. Government officials at Trebizond picked up some of the prettiest Armenian women of the best families. After committing the worst outrages on them, they had them killed.
Many women and older children aged 13 to 14, realizing what was going to happen to them, ended their lives with suicide.
They would kill the men, but they would take the women and make them part of the harem for the Turkish family, and then force them to become Islamic, force them to become Muslims. The taking away of whole groups of the other people is a form of genocide.
Grandfather, however, was smart enough to know what was going to happen. He saw the handwriting on the wall, and he went to his Turkish neighbor, the closest one he had, and he said, "Listen, you don't have children." He said, "And my child is going to be left, fatherless." He said, "Take everything, take my house, take everything in it, just take care of my son." And true to their word, they did. They took my father, and they raised him as a Turk, however. But my father had a half-sister who found him. She was on another, area, and she found him, and she said, "You're going to come with me. There's a Vorpanots over here. There's an orphanage. You need to come, over there." And she dragged him out of there, and he couldn't deal with it because he was a little boy and he only spoke Turkish. So he ran back to the Turkish family that he knew. But as he got a little bit more sensibility about what was happening and how they were teaching him to anidzel, to curse his Jesus, The second time when my aunt came to get him, she was only a few years older than him, by the way. She came and took him and she put him in the orphanage, and this time he stayed. He understood what was happening. And till my father's dying day, it was the saddest thing to have him remember what went on during that time.
After all, Turkey still denies that the Armenian Genocide took place. They explain that massacres took place by both sides during the Great War.
That argument leaves out is that it wasn't the Armenians who killed the Muslims. The people that from the Ottoman Empire who were killed by Allied forces, not by Armenians.
Not many Armenians survived by resistance. Only in the Armenian-populated mountain region of Musadah did they manage to survive by defending themselves until they received help from Allied French naval vessels. In other cities where Armenians tried to resist, they were mercilessly massacred by Ottomans. American Ambassador Henry Morgenthau was one of the few witnesses who adopted the Armenian tragedy as his own struggle and led the formation of a relief committee, Near East Relief, which saved tens of thousands of lives.
Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, who collected the reports from the Americans who were in the Ottoman Empire, individuals, missionaries, but especially his consuls, who were located in various cities, and sent all these reports to the State Department. And thereby, President Woodrow Wilson was advised of what was happening, and he encouraged the American people to take effort, to take measures, and to engage in humanitarian efforts to help at least the survivors who were stranded in Syria and in the Syrian desert. That made a huge difference, and at the very least, if the genocide could not be prevented, but as I say, in the very least, to try to help the survivors at the end of the war.
After the genocide, in total, only about 500,000 Armenians survived. All of them were refugees and stateless.
So where are those people? Those people are all over the world now. They've dispersed. There are 2 million in Russia. 2 million Armenians live in Russia, largely in Moscow. You have a tremendous number of hundreds of thousands in France. You have over 1 million in the United States. And as far away as India and Africa and so forth, the Middle East.
Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Russia, France, the USA, and many other countries became the new homelands for starving Armenians.
Before the war started, my grandfather sent my father to the USA. Afterwards, our father helped us to survive by bringing us to the USA.
My uncle, when he was 14, they heard there was going to be war. So my mother sent him to America. He avoided the war. That's how we came.
They came by steerage, very, very, low class, in the bottom of the boat. But they came to Ellis Island, and they stayed there a month and a half in Ellis Island until they were released. And my mother said it was the happiest moment of her life until that point. She said every morning the Americans would give us big bowls of oatmeal with butter and milk and eggs, and that was the first time that she had a full stomach.
In America, they were very good to us because they knew the story. They knew the story.
Today, of the remaining 10 million Armenians, less than 4 million live in the Republic of Armenia.
We didn't choose to be all over the world. We didn't choose like the dandelion blowing, it goes everywhere. But that's what we became. But in spite of that, in spite of all that diaspora and issue, we are still Armenian, and our heart is in Armenia.
Genocide brought also huge cultural losses. Armenian schools, libraries, monasteries, churches, and monuments were burned or destroyed.
Out of 2,600 churches and monasteries, there were only 7 churches left right now. Beside that, 85% of clergy were massacred. So a nation, a people was left without a shepherd, without shepherds, if I may use it, without a place to worship.
The Armenian people take pride in the fact that theirs was the first nation to accept Christianity officially as their state religion, which means to say from 301 AD for 1700 years, the Armenians have been a Christian nation. That makes them the oldest Christian nation on the face of the earth, and they have a huge heritage that they had created in Armenia. All of that was burned, destroyed, discarded. So the cultural losses, the economic losses have to be thought about and remembered as well, on top of the huge population losses.
Armenians tried to transfer their cultural values into the foreign lands. As survivors say, it was difficult to start a new life without knowing the new language and culture, along with all the tragic memories. However, they did not have a choice. They had to move on with what was left.
I must have been about 8. My mother was about 33. Yeah. And she did embroidery, crochet beading, gave it to people at home. That's how she made money. I tell you, it was very hard. I didn't know English. But I learned. Went to the library, got books and everything. And the church helped us. It was very nice.
1932-33, not many years after the Holocaust that the Armenians went through, these folks got money together in the middle of the Depression to hire an Italian music instructor to teach their children how to play instruments so they could have a band. So it was called the Murad Band. And the spirit of these people, the bravery to carry on. A lot of them didn't speak about the genocide because it was so horrible. The things they had gone through, the things they had seen and experienced themselves, they kept it to themselves for the most part. This was a bravery to come to this country and try to create a new life in the image of what they had known. And that's the best they could do.
The Armenian diaspora was going to be the people who could learn what it means to be free and to have human rights.
Remembering, understanding is important to prevention. Armenians everywhere have been asking their respective governments to recognize what happened to the Armenian people formally as a genocide, as a lesson to humanity.
We are the world's most powerful nation. And I know this from having been in the State Department and worked on UN resolutions and written a lot of UN resolutions. When the U.S. speaks at the United Nations, it is listened to.
The United States has been dealing with the genocide in a very tangential way. For instance, there have been 3 congressional resolutions in the 1970s and 80s, and President Reagan even called it an Armenian genocide and signed a decree to that effect. And then, as you know, there was a congressional resolution by a subcommittee calling it a genocide, and it's been held up now, even though President Obama said, I have not changed my opinion. It was a genocide. I have not changed my opinion. But he has still not proclaimed it a genocide officially from the White House. And this is obviously in deference to the Turks and Turkey's assistance in many ways.
In March 2010, the House Foreign Affairs Committee voted to condemn as genocide the mass killings of Armenians early in the last century.
To the Armenian people, I extend my condolences for their families of those who were killed and displaced. As members of Congress, we cannot change their past, but we can give comfort to those who survived and acknowledge the memories of those who perished.
Deportation of nearly 2 million Armenians, of whom 1.5 million men, women, and children were killed. 500,000 survivors were expelled from their homes.
According to the New York Times, the Obama administration, like the earlier Bush administration, is fearful of losing Turkish cooperation over Iraq and had lobbied forcefully to try to keep it from reaching the House floor.
We are powerful enough as a country that if we did that, it would make the Turks mad, all right, but they'd get over it. The truth is they need us even more than we need them. And evidence for that is what happened with France, when the French legislature passed just exactly that kind of resolution. The first thing the Turks did was cut off diplomatic relations with France, recall their ambassador, etc. Well, they restored diplomatic relations within a year, and now the trade between France and Turkey is 2 or 3 times as much as it was.
At this time, the future of either resolution is uncertain.
It's taken much longer than it should have, and we have made efforts, as you know, before with the Foreign Affairs Committee, and now we hope to get it on the House floor.
The Armenian question has become part of the political game between some world powers.
Many people come here and say, shouldn't we have both sides reconcile? We all long for that. We've seen in many parts of the world truth and reconciliation commissions, a truth and reconciliation process, and it's worked. I have not seen falsehood and cover-up commissions lead to reconciliation.
The nations, the countries should come together to recognize the atrocities done against any human being, against any nation, against any minorities or race or ethnicities. So it should not be accepted, any genocide based on the interest of superpowers.
The persecutors, those who committed the Armenian Genocide, obviously got away with their crimes, and they had no interest in remembering or allowing anybody to remember. They were able to do so for nearly 50 years after the Armenian Genocide. It is only since the 1960s and the 1970s, when the Armenian survivors recovered from their losses, created new communities, and new generations were born, that they were able to rethink on how to remember the Armenian Genocide, and as well as to create the resources, the publications, the books that you see behind me, where these events were recorded and explained and compared and studied. It took them a very long time, but it also reminds everyone that a genocide can be easily covered up.
There is no peace without justice. Justice must be done. I think that the Turks should come to Armenians and confess their sins, and then Armenians should decide how to forgive those Turks who have massacred their grandparents, parents, and relatives.
It would be extremely helpful for Turkey to recognize the genocide carried out by the Ottoman Empire, because I think it would help Turkey avoid future genocides in that country, in that society. To this day, they have trouble recognizing Kurds. I mean, as you know, for many years, the speaking of the Kurdish language was outlawed in Turkey, and you couldn't even talk about people who were Kurds. They were called Mountain Turks. I mean, that is the kind of, you know, in my view, foolish sort of intolerance that leads to genocide.
I don't want to have that burden for another 50 years, to carry that burden. I'm ready to forgive if they accept their mistake, if they confess their sin, if they acknowledge the atrocities that they have done, if they treat Armenians the way that they were supposed to be treated. If they treat any other minorities in Turkey, even today, as minorities, giving them the rights to live as minorities, giving them the right to choose their mosques, churches, or synagogues, and that will be the starting point of discussion with the Turkish government and the Turks.
For speaking out for Turkish-Armenian reconciliation and for human and minority rights in Turkey, Hrant Denk, editor of the bilingual Turkish-Armenian newspaper Agos, was assassinated by a 17-year-old Turkish nationalist in January 2007.
Hrant Denk had a policy not of condemning the Turks. He had a lot of friends among the Turks, but a policy of reconciliation. He wanted the Turks and the Armenians to get along.
Before the assassination, the Armenian journalist received 3 death threats for insults against the Turkish state. Hrant Denk believed that he could educate the Turkish people about events of 1915, but he paid for it with his life.
For his funeral, the streets were covered with Turks with signs saying, "Today we are all Armenians." Remarkable thing. Could never have happened before.
It is remarkable that awareness about the Armenian genocide has been growing in the last decade among Turkish intellectuals, writers, and even the general population. However, the ones who have the courage to speak up are called enemies of the Turkish state. The Armenian genocide is remembered and recognized by more than 20 governments and parliaments. Now that Turkey has showed its wish to join the European Union, the Armenian question has become more topical, relevant, and urgent.
If someone has to ask, why do it now? Why not put it off? How long are you asking these survivors to wait? And shouldn't we do it while they're here to see it?
We should go all together to the government and say that I, for example, have seen it. I lived through the genocide.
There are certain kinds of processes that can occur if there is an honest admission of what happened. One of those things, and I know this is a very controversial one, but nevertheless, one of those things is restitution. Restitution, for instance, of the churches in Anatolia. Armenian people should be able to restore those churches. There should be an opening of the border between Armenia and Turkey. There should be normal trade relations. Right now, Armenia is cut off, and that kind of thing is terribly damaging to the Armenian people.
When you have any kind of a treaty or establishing diplomatic relations, other things begin to happen. You have tourism, so you're going to have Turks in Armenia and Armenians in Turkey. You have cultural exchanges, student exchanges, journalistic exchanges, so forth. You're going to have orchestras, cultural exchanges, orchestras, ballet groups, movies, and so forth, so on. When you get this kind of a mixture, you're going to get those who count, which are the people, not the governments, the people. And the people will bring pressure, and that's the way I think the change is going to take place.
I think it should come from the people and not from the government, because the governments are not very much interested to accept the reality. It is for their interest to keep everybody quiet, and that's not something that will be very much appreciated by future Turkish generation, because one day they will ask their government, why did you kept the Armenian genocide secret? And somebody has to answer that question.
One of the best ways probably to present it is not just that this was part of our national history, but to do a more general study of the problem of genocide in the world, and so that Turks understand it's not just their problem. It is their problem, and so they have to face it. Facing History and Ourselves is the name of a group that is particularly dedicated to this kind of educational process. And it's mainly about the Holocaust. But that same process has to operate in a lot of other countries, Turkey, for instance.
From generation to generation, stories of the now elderly survivors have been passed on. Now it is the Armenian youth who want their young voices to be heard.
They massacred, they genocided, they slaughtered without any reason. We hope that we can get worldwide recognition, and after that, move forward to securing our rights.
So if we earn our apology, then maybe we can start normalizing our relationship.
Yeah, we're not trying to make enemies, we're just trying to make things straight, just get our justice out of it.
99-year-old Anush Avetisyan still lives with the fear that Turks will come at any time to murder her and her loved ones.
Bring your parents to America. It is freedom here.
She survived the genocide physically, but emotionally she is still suffering from the tragic events. In her mind, her homeland will always be that dangerous place from which she escaped in order to survive.
Are the Turks still there?
It is hard to imagine what will heal the wounds of people who witnessed genocide, who have seen their loved ones dying of hunger or being murdered in the ways that were even more brutal.
This is a wound that's never healed for Armenian people. It's like telling someone whose relatives have been murdered that it was all there in their imagination. It continues the crime, if you will. It continues the crime of genocide because it's a way of continuing the effort to destroy the group.
Now imagine for a moment, someone wrecks your life completely, deliberately, and then all you hear is, it was wartime. Nothing happened intentionally. It is all your imagination. It is not the right time to discuss this, say people around you whom you thought were truthful and honest. How would that make you feel?
This difficulty of recognizing our common interest, the human interest, is the big leap that we need to somehow achieve. It's the next step, really, in fighting genocide.